So I've got Mike in the middle here. Mike is the current director at IAG Firemark Ventures, Australia's largest general insurance company. Firemark Ventures have a global focus to invest up to 10 million in Series A above funding rounds. His special areas of interest include insurtech, fintech, AI, and data analytics. Mike, can you tell us a little bit about your experience working in the field of AI?
Sure. So my background, I guess, is from the investment side, so I'm not technical in any way, but I obviously understand, I guess, the concepts broadly enough and how they apply in a practical way to organisations. So, as you mentioned, IAG is an insurance company, and the funny thing when you think about an insurance company is that it's really a data company at its core. So what insurance fundamentally is how you understand your customers and then understand risk. So right now there's a bit of an arms race across insurance companies around the world as to how you can access the best quality data and the most unique data sets, but then more importantly, how you can apply the smarts on top of that data to get real value out of it. And inevitably those smarts come out of technologies like deep analytics or machine learning or computer vision, or building its way towards real AI, which that doesn't seem like it's a here and now technology. It seems like we're getting the building blocks towards truly building a real cognitive AI. But the applications we've certainly seen in our business have been what can be applied today, which is typically what I would define in the space of machine learning, computer vision, and smart process automation or analytics. So my experience really is from looking at, what companies are doing what around the world, typically in startups that are building some kind of novel approach towards building these technologies and then investing with a view to bring them into the core of our organisation and seeing how we can apply them to get a competitive advantage.
And just as a quick flavour, are you able to share some of the startups that you've worked with in this space?
Yep, I can. So we've invested in a Stone & Chalk resident, Hyperena, which is a deep analytics AI business that's helping our organisation to democratise our data sets for non-technical users. So part of the data that we like to analyse is obviously for customers and risk, but the other part is how we make business decisions, so our own internal data sets as well. So Hyperena, if you're not familiar with that, it's a tool that can be layered on top of a data set where you can query that data in natural language and then get a response back that a non-technical or non-data scientist would actually understand. So it's typically a visual answer with graphs and charts that interprets the data in a way that gives you the right answer based on your natural language question. So we've invested in them. We've invested in a computer vision business as well out of the United States called Arturo. So this is more applied, I guess, to the insurance or the core insurance part of IAG. They effectively take aerial image data, so whether that's from satellites or from airplanes, they ingest that data and run it through a computer vision model that then understands the attributes of what is in those images. So namely the built environment, so households and structures and buildings, and then understanding what those buildings are made out of, what the roof looks like, what the characteristics are, and then correlating that against insurance risk. So saying, well, this is a 4-bedroom house that's got 2 floors, it's got a roof made out of terracotta tiles that's pitched in this direction, and we think there might be a risk of water damage in this back section of the house. So it's an automated process that does this at scale for every household in the United States and Australia at the moment. But you can see how this is a very practical application of a computer vision and machine learning technology that's obviously relevant for our business. And there's been a few others as well, so it's firmly within our focus.
2 very different areas and applications. Yeah.
Very different.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So next to Mike, I've got Phillipa Beltran. She's the Chief of Customer Operations at Flamingo AI. Phillipa has a wealth of experience in customer experience, working with mid to large enterprises across a broad range of industries and helping organisations identify their CX challenges. So Phillipa, can you briefly explain what Flamingo AI does?
Yeah, of course. So Flamingo AI helps organisations solve the knowledge sharing challenge. So 20% of everyone's time is actually spent looking for information to help them do their job every week, day a week, just looking for information. And that leads to enterprises incurring millions of dollars of loss just because people can't find or share information internally and externally. So the Flamingo AI Smart Hub essentially just helps organisations get the right information at the right time and be able to provide that to the people that they need to. But in doing so, we also then provide our clients with actionable insights and knowledge analytics around how people are consuming that information across their organisation.
Amazing, thank you. And Dima here, right next to me on my left. Dima is the Chief Computing Officer and co-founder at Grenade. Dima has a background in data processing and visualization, web development frameworks, and database management systems. He has previously worked as a chief data scientist and also teaches data science at General Assembly in his spare time. Dima, can you explain a bit about what Grenade does and why you decided to start the business?
Well, Grenade started as an imbalance in supply and demand. There were a lot of people talking about AI and smart applications, and they didn't see enough companies actually building smart applications. Since my professional experience taught me a fair bit about building such automation, we've decided to start Grenade. And for the last 6 years, we've been providing a consulting service to large corporate clients, helping them turn their data sets into data assets by, again, building smart automations on top of their data sources. I think that in terms of the current state of the industry, there is a lot of talk about AI and just not enough understanding of what that actually means. So in computer science, AI is used to refer to any kind of smart automation. It's actually a very broad term. I think the quip goes that AI, it's a thing that hasn't been done yet. So some of the areas that historically were considered to be AI are now just sort of productized and commoditized applications that are part of the software engineering domain. Colloquially, people refer to AI as some kind of cognitive application. So something that learns, something that can reason. Computer science actually turned around and declared that they would refer to that as AGI, so artificial general intelligence. Just to distinguish it and avoid the confusion, but I think people didn't get the memo. So the difference and the distinction lies in that if we're talking about solutions and implementations today, we're talking about either robotics or machine learning. These are the two broad areas that you can bundle everything under. Everything else is sort of more a discussion about the philosophy and the approaches that we have no idea how to implement or design. And yeah, also another term that frequently gets mixed up with all of this is data science, which I like to define as well. So data science, it's a term that didn't exist when I was doing my undergrad. All of the core subjects, again, were sitting under computer science. And when this job was introduced to the industry, there was a tremendous focus to deliver solutions. And so science came from, I'm guessing, scientific hypothesis testing, where you start by coming up with a really good question, figuring out what data you're going to look at, what hypothesis you're proving or disproving, and then doing some data analysis. So that made machine learning and any kind of smart analytics a part of the work setting for most companies by giving concrete objectives to people with relevant skills. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations forget about it.
And what about machine learning?
So machine learning is an area of applied mathematics. It's a set of techniques for processing large volumes of data for very specific purposes. This is not something that's easy to extract value out of if you don't have very concrete goals for your projects. That's why I guess data science had more success in the industry.
Thanks for clarifying. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what those terms mean, so that was very helpful. So I want to get stuck into today's questions, and I want to start off by looking at some of the challenges that businesses face when they bring AI in. So this is open to everyone, and Phillipa, we might start on your end of the panel. We know that AI has a huge potential to transform business. What are some of the challenges you see in terms of how receptive businesses are to change and bringing AI into their organizations?
I think for Flamingo AI, so we operate both in Australia and the US, with the majority of our clients actually US based. The key thing that I see is here in Australia, there's actually quite a conservative approach to adopting technology, quite a risk-averse industry, especially in the financial sector, which is where we primarily play. And so I think one of the the biggest challenges that we've seen is that willingness to actually take a risk on not just new technology, but also a young organisation like Flamingo. And also the understanding, to Dima's point, of what AI actually is, and thinking that it's something that can solve every problem, and it's just one organisation that you're looking for who's going to be able to solve every single challenge that you have in your business. I've seen a shift over the last 5 years while I've been working with our clients, where they start to now understand that actually it's going to be much more of a partnership approach, where they will have different providers in place for different challenges that they have, and starting to understand that there's been that shift. That's probably the key things that I've seen.
So I'd say IAG has been really forward-thinking in this regard and wanting to adopt new technologies, as I sort of described earlier. The real challenge, I think, is, or at least that I see at IAG anyway, is people getting too carried away with the concept of AI, and like you mentioned, not really understanding what it actually means, and then thinking that this is just the word AI applied to any technology is going to solve all of our problems because, it says AI on it, which is not the case. And as I mentioned, I'm non-technical myself, so I need to sort of catch myself to make sure I don't, get carried away either without really understanding how this stuff works. I think I've got an okay at that, but certainly other people in the organisation get overly excited about some new technologies that they think is going to completely, improve their particular business area or solve all their problems. I think we're lucky at IAG because there's a very strong team of data scientists and very technical people who are able to sort of see through the hype and bring us all back down to reality. So we try to pair up with them when we're looking at a new opportunity to, one perspective is the excitement around what this could do, then the other perspective that we sort of quickly get as well is that no, this is all just hot air, and this is not really going to solve anything, and what they're really doing is not even AI, and it's not going to be a practical application that's going to help you. So I think finding that balance is important for us in navigating our way towards technology that is proven to work, and putting aside all the terminology of it. So I don't particularly care if somebody calls himself an AI platform or a computer vision platform or a machine learning platform or an automation, whatever. I try to just understand, are you actually solving a problem that's important to us? And does your technology actually do what it says it's going to do? So in the case of the company I mentioned earlier, Arturo, it's a great example of that. Us understanding what we're ensuring in the built environment is a really important part of our business. So a company that can prove that they're doing that, and I don't necessarily care how they're doing that, but if they're taking these images and understanding what is in them and then feeding that information back to us so we understand what we're insuring, and that works, and then I correlate that against our actual insurance risk to see if it's improved our models, then that's pretty compelling. So yeah, I think the challenge, sorry this is a long-winded answer, but certainly our biggest challenge is just seeing through the hype and getting to the practicality of the technology.
Yeah, the hype definitely isn't helpful, is it?
No.
Dima, what about yourself in your consulting work?
I think that I resonate with a lot of what he said because there is a tendency to think that you can buy the next off-the-shelf tool to solve all your problems, because that's what marketing department's job is, to make you believe that whatever tool that the company sells will solve a variety of issues that you have as an organization. But understanding what lies at the core of these issues and what solutions has the organization already implemented to combat them, that should be seen as the first step. So the level automation is almost secondary to what is the problem that you're actually trying to solve in the first place. It would be quite important for organizations to focus on problem solving rather than tooling.
So I imagine there must be a bit of education required of your clients before you can even really talk about the solutions in terms of what's needed.
So it's where I've started. So I typically open with the pitch explaining what we are not, and we are not a company that will sell you a magic box that will do all things that you require. And in my experience, it's almost impossible to buy such a box unless it's for very, very narrow niche purpose. So instead, if you think backwards from what are you trying to achieve and then produce a solution that accomplishes that, you are guaranteed much better success rate in practice.
On the topic of your clients, Grenade's worked with quite a diverse range of clients. What insights or observations can you share with us about how different industries are responding or adapting to AI technology?
Yeah, thanks. That's an interesting question. So I think that in Australia, fintech has been the only industry to kind of properly jump on AI bandwagon because I think that a lot of it was kind of prompted by recent just government shake-ups. So a Royal Commission, I think, prompted a lot of the initiatives. I see very similar things happening in the insurance industry right now, with a lot of sort of interesting projects emerging from the latest shake-up there. The incentive for innovation needs to come from somewhere. It's really interesting how a lot of the automation that happened in US hasn't been implemented here, and I have a theory for it. So the automation that I'm discussing is basically reporting automation. So what your average sort of lower to middle end management's job is to collate some numbers from several sources and present them back to their management together with a story. It turns out that we can automate it pretty well these days, but the incentive to actually depart on projects that automate management out of jobs hasn't been what I would hope it would be. And the reason for it being that we're not experiencing any kind of tectonic shift in Australia. It's just very, very, very slow transition.
Phillipa, what about yourself? I mean, you've worked across, or rather Flamingo AI has kind of serviced a diverse range of clients. What are you seeing as some of the differences across industries and perhaps geographies?
Yeah, apart from what I've already mentioned with attitudes towards adoption, I think the key thing that I'm seeing as a shift is the realization that, as I mentioned earlier, AI is not going to solve everything. There'll be different players. But when we first started in the industry, it was really around chatbots, and chatbots were the only way that you were going to communicate with your customer, and that was what you had to have, and that was what your AI needed to do. And that's certainly the space that Flamingo started in. And then we realized that actually that's really not a lot of the problem, and that can be quite a frustrating experience for an end user when you're interacting with a chatbot and it's unable to answer, 70% of your questions, and it needs to be escalated to someone. And so we started to work more with our clients to help educate them, as you were saying, Dima, but take them through that journey of actually starting to understand what were the problems that they were trying to solve. And not everything needs to be solved with AI. Sometimes it is just an RPA process that you need, or it's just business process improvement that you're actually going through, and identifying when it really is an AI problem. So I think having that open relationship with our clients across industries has really just helped understand, when there is a good fit and when there's not a good fit, and seeing that organizations start to understand that and move away from AI only means chatbots and really applying it to the right solution has been the biggest shift that I've seen across all industries.
And I just want to take that to like a more geographical kind of level as well. So, Mike, I'd like to get a little bit of some of your opinions on the global perspective. So, where does Australia stand in terms of its adaptation and reception of AI, and what do you think needs to change in order for Australia to maybe level up?
We spend a fair bit of time looking in the US. Obviously, it's just a bigger market and a more mature market in terms of the startup ecosystem and the technology ecosystem. But the Australian market, I would say, has come a long, long way, I think, in the last 5 to 8 years. But the reality is it's still small, and it probably always or will be for the foreseeable future. And I think it's not through a lack of talent. So, for example, I was in Adelaide yesterday and I was meeting some groups out of the University of Adelaide. They have a machine learning and AI team down there, of function down there, with about 100 odd people, and really talented people, really smart people. But there's still this commercialization challenge that I think they face. And I think part of that comes through probably more experience being needed. So what I mean by that is so I spend a fair bit of time in the US, and when you talk to the companies in the US and the startups in the US, their approach towards commercialization is far more aggressive than our approach towards commercialization. And they seem also probably a bit more, I guess, mature in terms of how they approach that as well. So they're more open with regards to sharing and trying to sell early and trying to make a business out of something early, where the culture in Australia that I've observed, at least in the very specific AI machine learning space, it's very technical and not necessarily so commercial, and it's also quite secretive. It's very hard for these, if you're a researcher, to commercialize it and build a business if you're not really willing to tell anyone what you're doing. which seems to be the first obstacle I often face as an investor when I'm trying to understand, what are you guys actually working on? And they say, well, we're not going to tell you, because not until you sign, a dozen confidentiality agreements and you meet this person, and then that's just not practical. So you start to look in the US where everyone's, beating down your door to say, this is what we're doing, this is the problem we're solving, and this is how you can sign up and be a part of it. I think that's probably a cultural shift that hopefully will change over time, but I certainly don't think it's through a lack of talent. And I think there's now more than ever more support, both in terms of government support and also investor support for it. So there's fantastic initiatives that come out of the CSIRO and Data 61 and all these other, and the universities, but I think there's still just a bit of a gap in terms of how we commercialise it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, we hear a lot about Australia being a bit risk averse, but that comment that you made on, how aggressive the startups themselves are in terms of their willingness to share and sell and commercialise, that's a really interesting point.
It surprises me, and I sort of shake my head at it sometimes because it's, it leads to a negative outcome, I think. I'd be interested to hear what you think about that, given you're, far more technical and probably come from that environment more than me.
I can easily agree with the picture of Australian technical startup that typically comes out of some research lab, so it has more academics than business-oriented and salespeople, and people can't effectively market and explain their technology, so I've seen that. My first job in Australia was a computer vision startup, 15 years in the making, that ships automation to GM for their cruise program now. It operated as a research lab for the first 10, maybe 12 years. That's the culture. But what you're saying about that there is no lack of talent, I would so strongly disagree with that.
You think there is?
I think there is a significant gap in terms of what the market needs and what's out there and available for hiring today. There are great PhD students out there, but there's so very few compared to, again, to US. And the intakes for these courses in the universities, they're tiny. And a lot of the newer programs that universities released for data science, they're doing students a great disservice. It's important to remember that there are two core skills: statistics/mathematics and computer programming. If you don't really teach either one at any level of depth, you're doing someone a really great disservice. I've seen people at the interview that can't write a one-line program because, I don't know, they're stressed or something after a 2-year master's program with high distinctions. It baffles me, and I don't understand how that could happen, but I've seen it multiple times. And the number of people who are sort of positioning themselves as AI talent who don't have the slightest clue is really high, and it makes me quite upset.
I would also add to that, business orientation would be the third pillar. So when we have people who are experts within machine learning or data scientists but are just far too academic and can't actually translate that to the business world, it becomes really hard to work in a partnership with them.
Starts me off on a rant that I love to get into. So there was a wonderful organization back when I was doing my undergrad. It used to be called NICTA. NICTA wasn't a commercial organization. In fact, it was purely academic, and the vast majority of people that the organization employed were really esteemed computer scientists. Then in 2015, Australian government decided to commercialize that research and formed Data 61. And it came to some of the smartest guys on the planet. Honestly, this was easily top 10 best school in the world at the time. And it came to these researchers, I'm guessing earning, somewhere around $150,000 a year, and said, hey, wouldn't you like to work on these projects instead of the research that you put the last 20 years of your life into? And they said, no. And that's why Professor Marcus Hutter is at Google Brain now. Professor Scott Sanders is at the University of Toronto. And I could go on, but essentially all of my old professors, they're no longer teaching here. So there needs to be a careful balance of how you try to commercialize research. So what large companies in US are trying to do, and again, that comes back to the capital. So because in US the capital is there, large companies can afford to hire academics just for their research to allow them to release that research for everyone else to use for free. Because they're interested in the research rather than in some commercial application. They have people to work on the commercial application. Where would that investment come from in Australia? I mean, I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
We need a government rep on the panel.
But so we talked about this a little bit before the panel, just the difference in the ecosystems. So what you just told me then is, I'm not that familiar with the fact that these big US technology companies are hiring academics purely for the research. So that's an interesting thing, particularly if they're poaching, Australian talent and they're going to the US to earn significantly more money. I can see how that's a challenge for developing talent here in Australia. But that is also a fundamental difference in that the US and that area of Silicon Valley has obviously been so much more established and mature over 40 years with significant amounts of capital, where companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook and all these giant companies that are almost inconceivable in their size compared to any Australian technology business. But the sort of flywheel effect you get from that, where there's a lot of venture capital in that market, there's really big established businesses, they have a lot of talent, it's a small geographic area, there's only so many people, that jacks up the price of the salaries, so people get paid more money to go there because everyone's competing for talent. And then those giant companies as well have the capability to acquire smaller companies. So, and we sort of talked about this a little bit in that, in Australia, if you're building a AI-orientated company, you better figure out how to make money from it. And that's just the reality of Australian business. And we sort of see that as being prudent and practical, that you need to build a business that'll make money. You can be a core group of researchers in Silicon Valley that take a risk to develop a new startup trying to solve some novel problem. Maybe you don't figure out how to commercialize it, but you've built something that's still very unique and interesting, and there might be real IP in the technology. And then you've got an active M&A market where this idea of the acqui-hire is very common amongst these big organizations, where they'll acquire a small startup of 10 or 15 or 20 people purely for the talent and a bit of IP. You don't really see that happening here. Like, who's going to acqui-hire an AI startup here in Australia? It just doesn't happen as often, or I certainly haven't seen it happen as frequently as what you see it happen in the US. So it's no mistake that most of these technologies and most of the advancements come out of the US, because that environment in Silicon Valley is just perfectly set up to continue fostering that growth and that to happen, whereas we just have a long way to go, unfortunately. I think it's more than a lack of capital. I think at the moment the challenge in Australia is that, because it seems that capital, how much capital is available is an easy thought process to go through. So you go, okay, well, we need more capital, because if we have more capital, then these startups with interesting ideas are going to, they'll emerge and get the funding they need. I think it's more nuanced than that, the problem. I don't think a amount of capital on its own is going to solve the issue. And my feeling is right now in Australia, we probably have the right amount of capital. I don't necessarily think we need now more venture capital funding early stage startups. This is radically different than 5 years ago, by the way. So 5 years ago, there's something like, there's no capital. There's like less than 500 million in venture capital in a year. I think now it's up to 2 billion or something around that amount. And if you go back even further, to 2010, there's virtually zero venture capital. So I feel like right now it's grown very quickly, and probably the right thing to do is to try and work out how we make the most of the capital we do have. I think sometimes when there's too much money in the system, then bad ideas get money for the sake of people getting excited about the prospect and thinking that all startups are going to be successful and we're on this venture capital bandwagon and it's going to be great. So I don't think it's necessarily just capital. I think in the US there's just more, there's multitude of factors that lead to that success, and capital is one part, but the rest of it is equally as important.
So there's a bit of catching up that the rest of the kind of puzzle has to do to kind of match the
there's the rest of catching up. We don't really have any giant technology companies in Australia other than Atlassian, and how many everyone is in America. Cisco, IBM, Amazon, Google, Facebook, like the list. And these are companies worth $500 billion to $1.5 trillion. Atlassian is our biggest. They're not listed here. What is it? $40 billion business. Like the gap is just like when you actually put it in those numbers, it's an astronomical gap. And what do we have under Atlassian in terms of a technology business? I don't know. Do we have any others at scale? I don't necessarily think so. Canva is a great startup success story, but it's not a Google. It's not a IBM. They're not going to drive the ecosystem. I guess what I'm trying to suggest is it's hard to, when you think about just the context difference between Australia and the US, it's not like apples and oranges. It's like apples and bloody, at a totally different species of something else. It's a really hard thing to solve for. And I agree that, I think we could do better. And everyone wants to do better, or a lot of people certainly want to do better. It's why organisations like Stone and Chalk exist, and many of these other organisations over the last 5 years have come to be to try and do better. And I think it's hard to, I certainly don't have the answer, but I try to look at places like Israel, for example, and these other hubs that have emerged and come from a low base to being a success story. And you sort of ask, how did they do that, right? Like, how did Israel come from... Very easy, I can... Okay, well, maybe we have the answer. So I'd be interested to hear that.
Look, I think that in Israel, everything rests on 3 pillars. One is there is a lot of talent. And that's something I was talking about earlier. A lot of the talent actually comes out from the army. So there is a very significant channel of additional talent that comes from army programs. And army gets the pick of the litter. So they pick the smartest kids who are really interested in some specific areas like security. And in 3 years of army service, they make security experts out of them. If you add a 3 to 4 year technical degree on top of that, you realize why Israel is leading in terms of security startups globally, like that they're unrivaled in terms of venture capital acquisitions. Second pillar, in my opinion, is capital. So obviously, if you have a lot of money, people finance stupid things. Like, I still think that Uber will never be profitable. I just don't see why it would be based on the current balance sheet. And people are investing in Snap. Like, that's all right. You need to have all of these to have a few good ones. But then the overall market is huge. And some really, really big companies came out of these small ventures. And the third one that's purely an Israeli thing, it's called chutzpah, which translates roughly as boldness. So everyone thinks that they're the smartest person when it comes to their area of expertise. And while it's almost toxic when it comes to arguments, it does lead to a very productive environment where people don't hold their opinions to themselves and stay quiet for the duration of the conversation, only to whinge that something is not to their liking. If you think that there is a better way to do something, it's very common to interrupt the person speaking and propose it straight away without listening to them. And it takes a while to get used to, but I really dig it, honestly.
And I think something that we were talking about earlier, and you mentioned it on the panel earlier as well, is just the rigor around education. And is our education system really pumping up the quality and rigor that we need to kind of create that talent pool?
That's the thing that scares me primarily, because I've been employing people and working with people in AI and software engineering space for nearly a decade. And I have tutored mathematics when I was in my undergrad. And I saw what new maths is. So I finished high school in Israel, so I haven't seen new maths until I started tutoring it, and then realized just how watered down can mathematics be, and why were people really struggling in basic introductory courses in university, because they've never seen real mathematics until they got into their undergrad programs. They were, instead of solving equations, they were solving problems that with words would make, more abstract problems for them to be more engaged in. This is just not how mathematics can be taught. At some point, you really need to add a bit of rigor. Success stories from these space do prove that this is the only way to get the level of discourse up. And then people are really surprised when not a lot of young people want to study computer science and statistics and mathematics and all of these wonderful subjects. that are actually really required by the workforce right now. And the reason for it being is if you haven't done it up until you're 18, you might be a bit too old. It's like professional sport. If you've never run a quarter mile in your life, and then suddenly at the age of 19, someone tells, now you do 2K, it's actually pretty hard. Like, this is something that you have to gradually work up towards. So I think that the responsibility of early education is to sit with someone. So I read an interesting paper that suggested that, say, in some West African countries, girls actually are a lot more interested in STEM than they are in the developed world. And I don't remember the exact statistics. And the reasoning that the article suggested was that STEM offered more career opportunities. Therefore, more children overall were drawn towards these opportunities. So in Israel, I think that there is a writing on the wall. People with the nicest paychecks, they're people working in high tech. And that's a whole industry by itself with average salary levels 2-3 times higher than the rest of the general population. I think that in Australia, no one has to try that hard to succeed, because ultimately you can be maybe, twice better off than someone, not 5-fold. So it's low risk, low reward kind of setting.
But I think also coming at the education point from another angle as well, and thinking about what it means to be in that future workforce when you do have a digital workforce that you're working alongside. I know some of the clients that we're working with are already starting to draw up their org charts of the future, which have their existing teams alongside digital workforce as well. And so I think part of it is also preparing people for that future and what is your role as someone in an organisation and a business, and starting to think about how you can help the organisation, not necessarily from I'm an expert in AI, but what is my role alongside AI and where do I actually add value to that organisation, and starting to help from an educational point, thinking about the things that make human expertise actually really unique from AI as well. So your understanding, your creativity, your ability to invent, solve, moral decision making, that's all going to become, I think, much more fundamental in the future workplace as well.
So on that topic, I did want to talk a little bit about the jobs and the future of how careers are going to change effectively. So, in a future powered by AI, what will jobs and the workforce look like, and how will careers change? And therefore, how do we need to adapt in terms of the way that we think about careers?
I mean, only to add to what I just said, I think research from Gartner has already shown that there is going to be a big change in what the job force looks like in the future. By 2025, it's expected that 40% of admin and services jobs will be gone, and those jobs are primarily filled by women and minorities, so that has a massive ramification across the workforce. But apart from what I've already said, I'll pass over to you guys if you wanted to jump in.
Sure. So I'm definitely not an expert in this area, but it is something I've actually thought a fair bit about, because I have 3 young daughters, and they're quite young, but I think about, how do you prepare them for the world? And you see these reactions, I think, where I guess part of my concern is maybe sometimes there's an overreaction to what is going on. So everybody seems to very much be on the STEM thought train at the moment, where it's like, we've got to teach kids STEM because people need to learn to code, and if you don't know how to code, you're going to fall behind and you're not going to get the best jobs. And I don't have any statistical evidence or anything to back this up, but my intuition tells me that might be a mistake to jump too far into thinking that one approach is going to be, right for everyone. There's some sort of basic conclusions that I've made, and one of them is that human creativity feels like it's going to be something that is important for the foreseeable future. I think that's a logical assumption. And while automation and machine learning is going to certainly change the workforce and the kind of work that a lot of people do, I don't think that humans are going to be removed from the equation entirely. So my advice that I'm giving to my 3 young girls, and that they're only at primary school age at the moment, so they're probably too young to really understand what I'm talking about, but I think the bigger question is trying to help people figure out what they are about and what they genuinely feel that they can contribute to society, and what they're good at and what they're interested in. And they might be orientated towards a path that involves coding, but I think it's a big mistake to try and suggest that if you don't know how to code, you're going to fall behind. I'm just not so sure that that's a reality. And something I've seen in my sort of generation, I guess I'm still reasonably young, but I just feel like people they jump on these bandwagons. So the funny thing when I was at high school was, if you wanted to pursue a trade, for example, like you wanted to be a carpenter or a builder, it was like, I'm not sure that's going to turn out that great for you. You're going to be doing this sort of unskilled work. Surely you've got to be a white collar. You want to be in an office. You got to go get a commerce degree, and that's where the money is at. The funny thing now is there's only so many builders around, and the guys I know who are driving Range Rovers and living in multi-million-dollar houses are guys that have building companies and are building successful developments. And you think, what the hell? How did that happen? And then you see all these other people, earning 50K a year as an accountant or something. So I think sometimes society jumps on the bandwagon just too much so, without necessarily giving thought to the real context of, okay, if a person figures out what they like, what they're good at, and then they pursue that, that's probably going to lead them to the best outcome. I mean, I can't speak for all businesses, but IAG has genuinely been very forward-thinking in this regard, because we have to, because it's an arms race in terms of adopting technology to understand data and have the best insurance product. So understanding the customer, pricing risk, and selling it, that's what it is. So it's sort of adopting technology is fundamental to our business. So it's more than, I certainly see a lot of innovation theatre in a lot of industries. In the building industry, for example, you see a lot of construction companies talking about having an innovation lab and doing AI, and sometimes you wonder what the hell they were really doing. But I'd say there's certainly a lot of organisations that are genuinely talking the talk and walking the walk. Insurance companies in particular, I think, seem to be doing it well. So many insurance companies have a venture arm, for example, and it's not a mistake that probably the majority of insurance companies around the world are doing this, because it is an arms race, different for different industries. But there's certainly, so talking about like how we're changing in terms of our workforce as well, certain departments are being more automated, and this is leading to change and structural change in the organisation. And I think there's also definitely an element of mistrust there when certain frontline workers, for example, whether it's call centre staff or people that were in a role previously that was a very important role but now can be automated, and then entire teams are disappearing. There's certainly an element of mistrust, I think, in the organisation as to, is my job stable, and can I really trust the organisation and trust the technology? That definitely exists. I think more as a general society trend, there's a lack of trust in all institutions and organisations, and probably technology change is certainly a part of that. I think the average person doesn't think about these concepts that we're talking about today. I think majority of people just want to go to work, do a decent day's work, earn a decent income, and just have dignity in their job. And they don't necessarily think about all these other structural things that are going on until one day they get told, oh, you don't have a job anymore because we're automating the call centre. And then you think, oh, how did that happen, and now what do I do? So I think that's a big challenge for society in general, and I don't know what the answer to that is.
From an implementation point of view with the clients that I've worked with, certainly one of the key things that will drive the success and the adoption of our solution within the organisation is where we centre the implementation around a change management piece, because as you were saying, this can be a really scary thing for a lot of people, and the expectations are not clear up front. So why are we bringing in AI? What does this mean for my role in 12 months' time? We do work with some call centres here and in the US, and there is certainly that level of fear as soon as you start to tell them that that's what you're doing. But similarly, we start to identify new opportunities and new skill sets that people can also have and get by working with us as well. And we have clients who jump on and start to add those skill sets to their own LinkedIn profiles as well. So people who are suddenly now brain trainers because they contribute to the AI in the organisation. And how you can start to surface the contribution that you're making to the knowledge within the organisation as well. So that's a real fundamental thing that we do. But certainly I think the change management piece, being really clear in setting expectations up front, is fundamental to the success.
I think that for people who are currently employed, the risks are generally not that great. I mean, for majority of people, the transition is going to be reasonably slow, apart from the service industry, again, which in Australia doesn't employ that many people. So the service industry, in terms of waiters and baristas, that's actually projected to increase over time. So jobs that aren't going away are service jobs, trades jobs, elderly care, that's the last one that's going to go away. And then all the coding jobs aren't going away either. And I haven't seen that STEM bandwagon that you're describing. It's just, I've seen a lot of push for soft skills, and for truckers to coders is a famous joke, yes. It is obviously impossible to transition an existing workforce to a completely different occupation that has nothing in common with what they're currently doing. But that's why the push needs to start early on. And the interesting thing about coding, that certainly has been my experience, is that coding today is sort of like reading in 1600s. So before Gutenberg invented the press, you were really fine. The only book that mattered was read out to you on a weekly basis, and there was absolutely no need to acquire the skill because you couldn't afford any books. They were all handwritten and cost as much as you would earn in 3 months of working. So, but then democratization of this and access to printed literature that is cheap and easy to produce made reading a very valuable skill. So in late 80s and early 90s, all the best software came from vendors. They knew exactly what you need to solve your business challenges. They packaged this up and sold it to you. It turns out that not every single business challenge can be bundled and packaged and sold. And all the best software today is actually published for free. It's absurd to think that largest free players in the tech space are actively competing in developing open source software tools for deep learning. That's all the fancy AI stuff. That's what everyone's calling AI. So all the tooling for that is not just free. There are free dominant players that are competing for just the market share. So for the developers to come and use their tools. So there is a gap between what's available for people to use and who can actually use it. And coding fills that gap really nicely.
Do we have any questions?
I know you've talked a lot about the fintech area, but what about government agencies? Is there much take-up of your services, and what are you saying about, processes being automated? Obviously, defence and all the huge community services that must have gigantic data sets.
So I'll just jump in quickly and then hand over. So Flamingo has only just started working with some government agencies. I think for us having, in the last 12 months, we've gone through a transition as an organisation, and our problem now speaks a lot more to organisations such as government as well. How do you actually solve that knowledge sharing problem? So we've only just started down that pathway, and from the experience that we've had so far, there's a lot of interest within that. But the other thing that I did want to jump in and say, working with the Australian government from the AI ethics framework as well point of view, that's quite an interesting pilot that we're undertaking with a few other telcos and big four banks at the moment, to help understand how businesses should actually utilise, implement, develop AI for their solutions as well. So just from those two angles, I just wanted to jump in.
I've delivered a very interesting pilot for ASIC last year, and I think there is an interest in uptake, but for government, everything is very, very slow. So, and I'm not sure why, but all initiatives need to go through a large number of revisions until they can actually satisfy all relevant stakeholders. Because typically I think that they start lower than they should start. So if the initiative came from somewhere higher up and said that that's it, we're doing this, it wouldn't be the same setting as running a pilot, hoping it doesn't offend anybody too much.
I just want to give a massive round of applause to the panelists who came out today.